were leaving the land of Egypt and headed toward the promised land. And how much did they have? They had been slaves. So what would they have? They have big, thick checkbook, big wad of money, big sack of gold? No.
And all the gold the Egyptians gave them to leave.
That's right. They were paid to get out of Dodge, weren't they? So they left with all of that. Now, I think that was providence, because God was going to have them build the tabernacle, and they were going to need a lot of that bounty, if we might call it, from Egypt to build that tabernacle. The point is, this kind of reminds me of that story. They had nothing, and so they honored them. I don't know that I'm stretching this at all, but if you think I am, well, then you can still love me. I see written all over this the providence of God. That God's providence, God had already told Paul, you're going to Rome. So everything that happened along the way was God working in Paul's life to get him to where he wanted him to go and where he wanted him to be. And so, beginning now, they're going to be going on their way to Rome. Rome is the next stop, or the end of their journey. And they're going to be going two ways. First of all, they're going to go by a ship, and then they're going to walk. They'll go on foot. And so the ship had a figurehead. Now, what would the figurehead have been? No, what's the figurehead on a ship? The very front. Yeah. Can you remember the old cars? I can remember. Some of us old enough to remember when the only color of a car was what color? Black. and there'd be, we called them a hood ornament. Put a big old, I can remember some of the Pontiacs and the Cadillacs, they always had a fancy hood ornament. Well, this was kind of the ornament on the front end of the boat. And there was two brothers named Castor. This is from Greek mythology. They thought that they were the twin sons of Zeus. And they were there to give them safe journey, to protect them, and etc. But then they stopped off at Malta or Melita, and from there they sailed over to Syracuse. And chapter 28, verse 13, they stayed there some 3 days. And then they made their way on to Rhegium, and that's on the eastern side of the southern tip of Italy, rather. And it was, then they went on to Petulia, and they found brethren there. And when they found members of the church there, fellow Christians there, they invited them to stay with them for a week. And so then they left there, and they headed to Rome. And they headed to Rome on foot. Now, good news as well as bad news spreads. They did not have a way to text back in those days, but the brethren at Rome heard that they were coming, and they came out to meet them. If that's in verse 15 of chapter 28. And some of them came 40 miles from Rome and met them at Apophorum, or the Appian Way, as some refer to it. And then some came 28 miles from Rome and met them at Three Havens. I believe maybe what Tim read called it the Fair Havens. And so the brethren were anxious to see Paul. the news of Paul had spread. He had written a letter to the church at Rome, and Paul wanted to visit there. In Romans chapter 1, and I think it's verse 11, he says, I long to see you, that I may impart unto you some spiritual gift. And that'd be through the laying on of his hands that he could confer, just like happened in the case of in Acts chapter 8 with Philip and the like. Now, Paul thanked God and he took courage. That's in verse 15. And finally, in verse 16, he arrives at Rome. And if you recall, in time past, the centurion had charge of Paul and on the ship. And so when they get to Rome, all 276 people that had been on that vessel were still alive. They had gone through some dangerous, perilous times. And then so the centurion delivered the prisoners that he had, that would include Paul, to the captain of the guard. And now the thing that was a little different about Paul, well, he was allowed to live by himself. And but there was a soldier that would guard him. So it seems as though they were treating him possibly a little nicer than the other prisoners they brought along with them. And he was being dealt with sort of with kid gloves, so to speak. But God's providence eventually led Paul to Rome. This is not the only time that Paul was a prisoner. And I think if